mocked his masculinity in front of friends for years, until he finally put me in my place. I don't know what I thought would happen. Maybe I thought he'd just take it forever. Maybe I thought it wasn't a big deal, that it was just jokes, just teasing. Maybe I convinced myself that if he never said anything, it meant it didn't hurt, that it didn't matter, but it did. And by the time I realized that, it was too late. This isn't a post where I defend myself. I know what I did. I know how I made him feel. I just want to talk about it. Not because I want to feel better, although maybe I do, but because there's no one left to tell. I'm not some evil bitch. I know it won't seem like it by the time you finish reading this post, but it's true. I know that I can be mean, a bit of an asshole. I've always known that, and he knew that too, but I don't know, I guess somewhere along the line I just got a bit carried away. It was something we did growing up. It was totally normal in my family. The teasing, the poking fun, even when the person being made fun of wasn't laughing anymore. That was how they built tougher skin. That was what I'd been taught growing up. I genuinely didn't mean for it to spill into my relationships. It never really did until we started dating. I never realized that it could be something that would end what was probably the best relationship I was ever going to find. It all happened 2 weeks ago, but it had been going on for much longer than that. For you to understand what happened 2 weeks ago, I have to give you some context about my relationship with him and my friends. We were together for almost 5 years, longer than I ever expected given my track record. His name is Richie, male 31. We met through a mutual friend who invited us both to the same game night. I was fresh out of a situationship and really not looking for anything, but he was easy to be around. The kind of guy who was quiet in groups but thoughtful one-on-one. He wasn't flashy or overly confident, but he was solid, grounded, steady. If I'm being honest, I wasn't very attracted to him at first or particularly interested. He was nice and sweet, but at the time I didn't think much of him. I'd always gone for guys who were more intense, loud, assertive, alpha types, if I'm being honest. I know that sounds a little icky given all the alpha male bullshit podcasters running around, but I don't know. I can't really explain it. I just naturally gravitated to guys who walked into a room and took it over. Guys who were sure of themselves and just a little bit demanding. Richie wasn't like that. He didn't command attention. He didn't command anything. He was just a different kind of person, and I didn't have the intelligence at the time to realize that. I had a weird way of looking at the world, of looking at men, and maybe that was part of the problem from the beginning. I mistook that softness for weakness, and I spent years making that mistake. We started dating about 2 months after that game night. He took my number that night, and we spent weeks talking on the phone. I'm not sure why I entertained it for so long when I was barely attracted to him. I think it was mainly because I was bored and he was just so nice and attentive. Like I said, we talked on the phone for a while, and I waited the entire time for him to be confident and just ask me out. But after weeks of nothing, I was forced to make the first move. I texted him and asked him if he wanted to grab coffee. He responded so fast and so enthusiastically that I immediately knew that he'd been wanting to ask me. He just wasn't brave enough at the time. And that was fine. It was whatever, honestly. I'm not superhuman. I've been nervous or anxious before, sometimes to the point where I couldn't do something that I wanted to. It was understandable. What wasn't understandable was that he also didn't take charge of the planning. I think maybe he thought it was polite and considerate to leave the ball in my court, but it just kind of irked me. I was left to pick the place, decide what time we would meet, call to let him know about everything. All things that I'd never had to do in my past relationships. He showed up 5 minutes early, said he was nervous but excited, and all my frustration kind of melted away a bit. Richie was so different and weird. There was something refreshing about a guy who didn't try to act cooler than he was. He just felt so real, and after years of dating guys who practically felt like walking stereotypes, Richie was a nice change of pace. Things moved quickly. We got serious fast. Being with him was different, but easy. With him, I took on a more dominant role than I'd ever had in any relationship. He was okay with me deciding, well, pretty much everything. He didn't mind that I was the leader between us. And it was good, it was great for a while, but it started to get a bit exhausting. I moved in with him about a year later. We fell into an easy kind of rhythm. I had the more stressful hands-on job while he had a decent remote job, so he was always at home while I was at work. It was comfortable, especially in those first few years, but somewhere along the line, I started changing the way I looked at him. I would come home, and there he was, in an apron ready to tell me about a new recipe he'd tried out for dinner, or about some new tacky decor he got for the living room. He was basically a house husband. I practically had a wife at home, and that kind of disgusted me in a way. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not a bigot or anything. I'm not trying to be rude or prejudiced or whatever. It's just not how I was raised. The house I grew up in, where my mom made all the food and took care of the home, and my dad came back every night sweaty from a long day of work, looked nothing like the one I currently lived in. Richie wasn't ambitious the way I wanted him to be. He made enough to cover half the bills, but he didn't have that hustler's drive that so many of the men I used to chase had, that my dad had. He was a graphic designer. There was the option to work physically, but he stayed remote, said that he liked the freedom it gave him. He liked having slow mornings and being able to take breaks in the afternoon. I didn't get it. I genuinely couldn't understand it or him. I had a 9-to-5 and a 5-year plan. I was chasing promotions, networking like it was a second job, and dragging myself out of bed every morning with the weight of my own expectations on my back. But he was nothing like me. He was a trust fund kind. I knew that going in, and I wasn't crazy bothered by it. I just thought it meant that he would always have a safety net. I didn't realize it would also have a really strong grasp on who he was. He wasn't lazy by any means. It was just that he put work into all the wrong things, the things that weren't important. I loved him, but I started resenting how easy everything seemed for him. So I started picking on him. At first it was little things, harmless teasing. Must be nice not having a real job, I'd say when he stayed in bed while I was busy getting ready for work. What do you even do all day? I'd ask when I came home to dishes in the sink or the kitchen a mess from his latest cuisine fixation. I didn't mean anything by it, or at least I don't think I did. I was teasing, and I guess, in a way, I wanted him to do better because of it. He was never fazed, though. He always smiled and played along, said he was lucky, that I worked harder than anyone he knew. But it didn't stop there. After months of comments toward him without him not even so much as flinching at how mean they sometimes were or how rude, I wasn't sure what else to do. I tried talking to him, but he had already explained to me multiple times that he just wasn't the 9-5 hyper-masculine type. I really wanted to love Richie for who he was. I really did, but it was hard for me. He was becoming harder to stand and tolerate. Each time I came home to him fussing around the house, it just made me feel so angry. I had no choice but to go to my friends. I knew it was a bad idea, but I did it anyway. My friends were worse than me. I grew up poor, but my parents, after years of hard work, were able to send me to the best law school in the state. It was where I met my friends. They were rich kids, and I was accepted into their group even though I wasn't. They weren't raised like me. They made comments and said awful shit just because they could, because they thought it was funny. I had been with Richie for a few years before I introduced him to my friends. I did all I could to avoid them ever crossing paths, because I knew that telling them about him or letting them meet him would be throwing him to the wolves. But after a few frustrating years, I did it anyway. They laid into him like I never had before. The way they made fun of him and emasculated him genuinely made me feel bad, and I was glad that they only ever did it around me. Never when Richie was present. My friends were horrible, and sometimes I joined them. I didn't want to feel excluded or anything. I was already different. I didn't want them to see me as any less than, and I knew that if I told them to stop, they would be upset by my attempt at moral superiority. And it's awful, but sometimes I agreed with the things that they said, and piling onto the mocking didn't seem like such a bad thing. Looking back now, I don't know why I did it. I think part of me needed to feel superior, needed to feel like I was winning at something, that I was the one holding us down. I didn't feel supported, not in the way I thought I deserved to be, so I punished him, quietly, in my own way. And that was how things stayed for a long time, for years. I would make little jabs at Richie at home and completely make fun of him to my friends. I would play up the role of unsatisfied girlfriend to them, even though I really did love Richie. They loved dissecting other people's lives because it distracted them from whatever bullshit was going on in theirs, and I, like an idiot, offered mine and Richie's up on a silver platter. I told myself that I was just blowing off steam with my friends, that if I could let some of my anger go with them, then I wouldn't take it all out on Richie. But that was a lie. My resentment for him only grew, to the point where just being around him started to nauseate me. The truth was that he was soft, and I'd been taught to reject that. Richie was completely oblivious to my inner turmoil and how it was ruining our relationship. He also failed to notice that I was staying out later and later. At first it was for work, and then later I started spending late nights with my friends, specifically nights with Otis. Otis and I had been friends since before I met the others. My dad had done some contracting work for his, and that was how we met. We became a lot closer over the years, and we kind of felt like a group within the group when the friend group expanded. I'd always had a bit of a crush on him, but he never actually returned my feelings. He never flat out rejected me either, though. We had this weird flirtation thing that went on for years and years. It was always a joke in the friend group that we would end up married, that we were made for each other. All that stopped when I got with Richie, though, but not for the right reasons. Even Otis settled down on his constant flirting and suggestiveness. But it was only because I was hiding him. They thought that I was perfectly happy with Richie and that I'd finally found a man that ticked all the boxes. But when I told them about him, and they actually met him, things changed after that. The rest of my friends would go back to teasing about Otis, but that was it. That was all it ever was. With Otis, though, that was a different story. To be fully transparent, it wasn't like there was never anything between us. Things were romantic at the start of college. We've kissed and we've had sex, but it was never official. Otis didn't do actual relationships. I'm only revealing this because it'll help make sense of what came next. Otis, out of all my friends, mocked Richie the least when we were all together. Not because he was a decent person, but because he reserved all his comments for when it was just us. He would not only mock Richie, but go on and on about how he was the man for me, and that Richie could never make me happy. In a way, he was right. Otis was nothing like Richie. He was the epitome of everything I'd ever wanted. He was confident, commanding. He took charge of any room, any situation. I think he thought that things with Richie wouldn't last, that I would come back to him like I always did after my relationships failed. But then years passed with Richie, and he started to feel threatened. Started to feel like maybe I wouldn't always be available forever. He came on strong, a lot stronger than before, and even a bit desperate. And I'm not going to lie, after years of being his lovesick puppy, it felt amazing to see him act so desperate. That was why I kept spending such late nights with him. Him wanting me so badly stroked my ego, but that was all it was. That was all it was supposed to be, but then one night, 2 weeks ago, things changed. I was at Otis's like usual. We were getting some drinks and talking. I'm not even sure how it happened exactly. I remember that he moved closer to me, but then again, Otis always did that. He also touched my arm and my thigh, both pretty normal by his standards, although Richie never knew it. Then he started telling me all this nonsense about how he'd always liked me and that he was just waiting for a good chance for us to be together for real. That we could have something real if Richie was out of the picture. He'd been suggestive, but he'd never flat out told me to leave Richie, so I was pretty shocked. And I knew it was bullshit, I knew that. He'd had years to make whatever was between us something real, and didn't. So why now? Why when I was with Richie? I knew he was just a spoiled brat going after what he couldn't have, and yet I found myself getting flustered. It was all I'd ever wanted to hear, what I'd waited years before Richie to hear. And now he was finally saying it, saying that he actually wanted to be with me. I'm not trying to make excuses for myself. I already said I didn't want to do that. I just want you all to understand that I was drunk and that he knew what he was doing. He knew that I still had some kind of feelings left for him, and he played it up like he felt the same. Having Otis's attention fully on me for the first time in years was beyond intoxicating, and maybe I did buy into his shit for a moment. I did believe that Richie wasn't man enough for me, that I deserved someone better. That was why I kissed him back when he kissed me, and that was why I went upstairs with him. It was so easy to slip into who we used to be to each other. I hadn't slept with Otis in years at that point, and yet it didn't feel like a day had gone by when we did it again. Eventually, though, the rose-colored haze I was in cleared, and I realized just what I had done. I panicked pretty badly, and I left. Otis tried to make me stay, but I just couldn't. Richie wasn't always what I wanted him to be, but that didn't mean that I didn't love him, or that I wanted to throw away what we had. I knew I had to stay away from Otis, and that, more importantly, keep him away from Richie. I knew that his ginormous ego wouldn't be able to handle seeing me with Richie again after what we had done together, and that he would try to ruin things. It should have been easy. I already separated my friends from my romantic life well enough. They barely saw Richie up to 3 times a year, but luck was not on my side, and it was only by the time that I got home that I realized that I'd already planned a dinner at the house the next week. I knew that it wouldn't be great. I knew it would be a disaster. I just never anticipated that it would ruin everything. The week leading up to the dinner, Richie was busy trying every recipe under the sun, hoping that he would finally be able to impress my friends, while I was doing all I could to keep Otis from coming. In the end, I was unsuccessful, and Otis showed up with the rest of them. I couldn't kick him out without looking suspicious, so all I could do was try to keep the peace and make sure that Otis kept his mouth shut, but of course he didn't. Everyone was sat down to eat when it started. Otis started with little jabs, asking who made dinner and if I kept Richie in an apron the second we were behind closed doors. Everyone was uncomfortable. My friends didn't know how to react. They'd never done that in front of Richie's face before. But when Richie laughed like he always did, and I didn't say anything, they took that as the go-ahead. The comments just didn't stop after that. They asked what Richie did for work again, and he gave them a calm, reasonable answer, but then their response was, "Oh, so you're just allergic to ambition then." At some point during the night, I started to feel like I wasn't in on the joke anymore, like I was being made fun of too, and my fragile ego couldn't handle it. I did the worst thing I could have done and joined in. When one of them mockingly asked about our work lives and how we split the bill, I joked and said, "He's a kept man." I said it like I was being playful, like it was just banter. But it wasn't. I knew what I was doing. Once again, I threw him under the bus to save my own skin, when he didn't say anything. I took that as permission to keep going. Then Richie stood up to grab dessert, and I handed him my phone to charge for me. That caused another round of teasing and something even worse. I didn't think anything of it at the time when I looked across the table and saw Otis rush to grab his phone and type something out. I should have been paying more attention, but how could I have known he would do something so awful? I thought Otis was an asshole, not a monster. It turned out that I was wrong. After dinner, we all moved to the living room for more drinks, but the mocking still didn't stop. We'd been drinking and playing some stupid table game, the kind where everyone has to answer ridiculous questions or do dares. One of the questions was, "Who wears the pants in your relationship?" Everyone laughed and pointed at me, and instead of letting it slide, instead of just smiling and moving on, I leaned into it. I don't even remember everything I said, but it was bad. I remember calling him soft and saying I'd basically been dating a wife. I remember saying that I made the money and the decisions, and that if he ever left, he'd be lost without me. And then Richie just snapped. Right there in front of everyone, he told me to get out. I was confused. We all were, except for Otis, who still looked smug. Richie told me that he was sick of me constantly feeling superior when all I was just an insecure puppet. I tried to calm him down, to ask what was going on. I'd never seen him so angry, so upset. It was like the Richie that I'd been with for years was gone. The one glaring at me that night felt like a different person. He reached into his pocket and tossed my phone on the table. I unlocked it, hoping for an explanation, and what was on the screen made me feel sick. It was a picture of me naked in Otis's bed. The sheets were covering me up, but I obviously wasn't aware that the picture was being taken. Beneath the photo, Otis had sent a message that read, "I'm still thinking about the other night, are you?" All I wanted in that moment was to throttle Otis, but I couldn't because Richie wasn't done yet. He told me that I was wasting my time sucking up to people who would never see me as one of them, and that he couldn't believe he'd let himself be talked down on by a woman who was so desperate for the attention of others. Then he revealed that he'd been thinking of leaving me for months now, but he thought that maybe we could still work things out even though I was so horrible. The message had been his last straw, though, and he said that he was tired of trying to love someone so cruel and disgusting. He said all of that in front of everyone else, and then afterwards, he told us all to get out. I had no choice but to walk out the door like the rest of them. It was his house. I didn't have a leg to stand on. Before he slammed the door in my face, he looked at me and then at Otis and said, "You two deserve each other." I tried banging on the door and calling out to him, but he wouldn't answer, and eventually I had to leave. I've spent that night and every night for the last week at my brother's place. The others have pretty much abandoned me. I mean, all Otis wanted was to prove that ignoring him had consequences, and he did. The rest of them, well, they were fine with bullying me and Richie for years, but adultery was where they drew the line. It wasn't a good look, what I did to Richie, and since his parents were influential, they all decided to distance themselves. None of that matters, though. Richie was right. They only ever kept me around as a punchline, and I was done hanging around for their amusement. I've spent the last week thinking about all I did wrong and why I was so awful to someone I loved. What kind of person does what I did? Claim to love someone and then chip away at their dignity day after day? I regret all of it. I wish I could just tell Richie that I'm sorry and that he's perfect the way he is. But of course he wants nothing to do with me, and I can't even blame him. I'd want nothing to do with me too.